照我原本的英文讲稿来读，就对。不好意思。但结束之后，如果有任何问题，就是欢迎直接跟我讲中文就好。Okay. Hi everyone. Today I want to talk about the future of Ruby documentation, what we have done in the last 2 years, and what will come in the future. I'm Stan Low. I'm a Ruby committer, and I've worked on several Ruby tools over the years, including the debugger, IRB, RDoc, and Relay. And last year, I also spent quite some time working on the Zjit as well. And when I don't write code, I climb and do calisthenics trainings. And so, for example, like I do front lever, and I did that in the RubyKaiki venue. And it's one of the tricks I train. And as you can see, if you drop your changes on the ground, it doesn't look as cool as you may imagine. And anyway, so that's my main hobby. And I'm also part of the Ruby developer experience team at Shopify. And we build and maintain tools like RubyLSP, Tapioca, and a new shiny tool called Rubyex. So speaking of Rubyex, it's a new Ruby code indexer my team is building. It provides static code intelligence, such as class and module resolution, method lookup, reference findings, for example. And it's fast, and it's built to be a foundation for other tools. And it even ships with a built-in NCP server. So right now at Shopify, AI agents can directly use this code indexer to help refactor our code base, for example. And my colleague Alexander Terrazan at RubyKaiki also gave a technical deep dive about this project. So if you are interested in this project or static analysis in Ruby, please make sure you watch his video once the video comes out. And in addition to tooling like Rubyex, Ruby's documentation also needs to work for AI too. And most of you will likely agree. And most of these expectations actually falls on one project alone, which is RDoc. And RDoc has been a backbone of Ruby documentation for more than 20 years, as Mufan just said. And it generates first the official Ruby documentation website, which you might be using. It also generates the data that backs the RI CLI. And finally, some of the gems, if they use RDoc as their documentation generator, such as Prism, Nokogiri, IRB, all use RDoc, then it will be used to generate documentation, API documentation for gems as well. So if we want to make Ruby's documentation work better for both human and AI, RDoc is where we need to invest our effort in. But honestly, RDoc at least in the past decades, it isn't ready for. It wasn't well maintained, and obviously right now it's not even ready for that future. So AI needs a few things from documentation. First is the accuracy. AI trains on documentation and builds assumptions based on them. Okay, sorry. So AI needs a few things from documentation. First is accuracy, because AI trains on documentation and builds assumptions based on them. So it also grabs stuff when making plans and then reference them when generating code, for example. So the API documentation needs to match the exact code structure. And second, the documentation needs to be presented in simpler content formats. And so for example, right now it's Markdown. And third, documentation should express clear intent. For example, it would be great if we have structured information like type signatures that AI can directly consume in a structured way and understand the intent of the code directly instead of natural language. And so that's on the content side, but AI also needs good tooling around documentation so it can help developers contribute to the documentation in our projects. So when AI tries to write and update our documentation, first it needs fast feedback. So it knows if anything is missing or like, for example, if a reference is incorrect. And it can also use incrementally generated documentation to verify changes quickly, instead of always generating the entire project documentation over and over again. And here's the thing, most of what I just mentioned, accurate documentation, type signatures, fast feedback, these are not just AI requirements. They are what makes documentation works better for everyone, including especially developers. And improving these things just got more leverage because we now have a new type of consumer, just AI coding agents. But RDoc has been failing to deliver all of these features in the past few years. First, its parser actually cannot handle newer Ruby syntax, so that means sometimes it's generating incorrect documentation. And its Markdown support also was incomplete and was very buggy, and which makes documentation contribution very difficult. And there's also no RBS integration, even though RBS has been out there for many, many years. And finally, without summer mode, we had to regenerate and manually open the HTML files in the browser after every single change. And also the dogfish thing was very dated and without even mobile support, and giving readers an awful first impression and then poor reading experience. So there's a long list of things we need to fix. And here's what we have been working on in the last 2 years. I will walk through each one of them. First is the visual change. So this is Dogfish. It's the all RDoc official thing since 2008, all the way until 2024. And it's clearly very dated in the era of 2020. So last year, I created Aliki. It's a new default theme with Ruby 4.0. And here's the light mode. It has better contrast on the content. It has redesigned sidebars. It has generated a table of content sidebar on the right. And also it has like improved search experience. And we are still improving it even until today. It also has a dark mode, which is turned on based on your system preference. And with Aliki, we hope to give Ruby developers a good first impression of the language itself, and also matches Ruby's aesthetics. And that's the new look. Now let's talk about what's being improved under the hood. So first, Ruby's parser was built on top of Reaper, and not just Reaper parser, but it only builds on the Reaper's tokenizer. And then RDoc re-implemented the Ruby parsing logic inside as part of it. So when a parsing logic in Ruby syntax has changed, RDoc needs to re-implement the same parsing logic over and over again to keep updated. But over time, because RDoc has missed maintainers for a few years, so over time, it actually failed to support some of the newer Ruby syntax. And to solve this problem, Tomoya Ishida, another Ruby committer and RDoc maintainer, last year he created a new parser based on Prism, and then fixed many issues along the way. Some of them even was reported in 2016, 10 years ago. And after the rewrite, the new parser is roughly half of the code, so it's a lot more easier to maintain. And we also benchmark it both on RDoc's code base, and the new parser came out 30% faster. And most importantly, when Ruby adds new syntax, RDoc doesn't need to handle it ourselves anymore, and we just let Prism handles it, so we can avoid the duplicate work. And here's one example. So the old parser, as I say, was built on top of a tokenizer, so it only works on tokens. So in this example, when Ruby first introduced endless methods, the old parser will incorrectly consume the food, classes, and token for the bar method. And then, so in this code, it will incorrectly assume the bath class is inside the food class. And then when it generates the class structures, it will have food bath instead of food class, and then bath class outside of it. And with Prism, the parser already knows how to handle a method boundary, regardless whether it's a normal method or a endless method. So RDoc now can easily know there's just one method, and then there are two separate classes. And next, let's talk about Markdown. So right now, Markdown is everywhere. No matter which tool you use, like GitHub, Stack Overflow, basically any development tools or documentation tool uses Markdown. And it should be the default in RDoc for many years ago. But RDoc actually has supported it since 2011, but the support was incomplete and very buggy. So features like strike-through, tables, and heading anchors were all half working even until earlier this year, until I fixed them. And so if you have used to writing Markdown on GitHub, if you right now write the Markdown in RDoc, you'll probably be very frustrated. So what do we write in Markdown what do we write in RDoc if Markdown is not the default? RDoc actually has its own markup language, also called as RDoc. And I believe many of you never learned about it before because very few people like the syntax anyway. And if you look at the syntax, it actually is very similar to Markdown. It uses equal signs for headings, and then it uses curly braces for links. So if you need to switch between RDoc and Markdown, it's very easy to confuse one to another. And that's one of the most common mistakes when people first want to contribute to Ruby's official documentation as well. And also, in addition to this annoying confusion, because of the way RDoc supports both markup languages, fixing Markdown bugs is actually harder than it should be. Let me explain this using an example. So this diagram shows how Markdown link is parsed and processed inside RDoc. The Markdown parser actually rewrites the link into RDoc's link syntax, and then uses RDoc's parsing pipeline underneath. So it's actually not a parser, it's more like a transpiler, and then built on top of the RDoc parser. And that means fixing any Markdown bug or supporting a new feature, for example, you need to update the entire chain, and then while maintaining the RDoc syntax compatibility. But despite this very messy, complex problem, we have been making some progress to make RDoc's Markdown closer to GitHub's version. So the table shows what we have improved since 2025. And this is one of the examples. So a year ago, RDoc's Markdown table doesn't support inline style, and then now it does. And in addition to these fixes, I also added JavaScript front-end side syntax highlighting to languages like Bash, Shell, and also C source code as well, which is important if we are reading the Ruby's core documentation on the website. And in order to track this systematically, and also give users a good visibility on what's working and what's not, I also created official documentation table to compare the current RDoc supports on Markdown and also what GitHub supports. And now let's talk about the type signatures. So RDoc will soon extract RBS type information from two sources. One is from the inline annotations in your Ruby files, and also .rbs files in your SIG folder. It will validate the syntax, just the syntax, not type checking your codebase, and then it will display them in both HTML output and RI. And here's what it will look like in Aliki. The type signature will show below the existing parameters section, so you can see the argument types and then return types in the glance. And when the types match the existing classes, you can see the underline. It will show that those classes can be clicked, and then it will lead you to those classes documentation as well. And that covers the content side of improvements. Now let's talk about server mode. This is a feature I believe will dramatically increase the developer's productivity when it comes to writing documentation using RDoc. So let's see a demo. So when you edit a file, once you save the file, the changes will automatically be reflected in the browser. You don't even need to refresh because it will keep polling on the server. So the server mode has 0 external dependencies. It uses just the Ruby's default TCP server. It has a background watcher to monitor files and only reparses the ones that needs to be reparsed. And right now the latency is between 100 and 200 milliseconds. And with future optimization, we hope to make the refresh instant. And any gems that uses RDoc can get this out of the box. Just run RDoc --server, and then you can run the server mode as like what you would do in other documentation generator. And then I also have integrated this into Ruby's documentation itself. So for example, the demo you just saw is recorded from the Ruby master documentation nowadays. So if you want to go contribute to Ruby's core documentation, you can already use this feature by running make HTML server. So everything I just showed you, except Aliki, which has already been shipped with Ruby 4.0. The Prism parser, the Markdown fixes, and RBS type signature support, and then server mode. Everything will be shipped in RDoc 8.0, which is scheduled next month. And that will be the next major release as well. And that's the foundation we have built. Now let's talk about what's still ahead. And there are 3 areas I want to focus in the near future. So first is that I want to make RDoc fully migrate to Markdown, so developers can write documentation in the language they are most familiar with. And second is I want to introduce some design annotations into RDoc. So, and as a way to explore like what documentation can express between on the design relationships instead of like just classes and methods. And third is that I want to find a way to make RDoc's documentation generated by RDoc LLM-Ready, AI-ready. So as I mentioned earlier, the RDoc markup is not the ideal language for documentation in this age. And that creates a major friction for people using RDoc as a tool, and then which includes anyone wants to contribute to Ruby's documentation. So I think in the long term, we should fully migrate to use Markdown as the only language for documentation in Ruby. But to achieve that, it means building an automatic translator from RDoc markup to Markdown. And then we need to migrate Ruby course documentation to Markdown, which I already got approval from the Ruby course team. And then finally, we need to turn the switch. So Markdown will become the default markup language. And I have wanted to make this change for a while, but now with AI agents, I think it will finally become possible and probably will only take a few months rather than a few years. I also want to explore using annotations to encode more code design information into documentation. So if you have used any type checking language before, you will probably be familiar with concepts like abstract methods, overrides, interfaces. But these concepts are not just useful in terms of like type checking languages. It's useful for documentation purposes as well. And the relationships these annotations describe will help both human and AI to understand the design better. So here's one example. Let's say you have a parent class informator defining an abstract method called convert that child classes should override, which is these classes actually exist in current RDoc codebase. And this is also a very common pattern you will see in Rails codebase, you will see in many gems. And in this case, you can use the abstract and override annotation to describe this information. And here's how it renders in my prototype branch. The abstract methods page will list every subclasses that implement that method, and each override page can link back to the abstract method. And if we combine these annotations with type signatures, it will let us create a more expressive documentation and benefits all consumers. And the final area I want to focus on is making documentation ready for AI consumption. But why does AI need something special in the first place? Well, it's actually all about tokens. Here's the same small documentation in two different formats, Markdown and HTML. And if you run it against a tokenizer AI agents will use, the Markdown version takes about 100 tokens, while HTML version takes about 150. The results will vary based on the specific tokenizers, but the gap should be pretty similar. Now let's see what this looks like in practice. So if you say you want your agent to learn about Ruby's array, and then you just ask it to read the entire HTML page, and the pure content after removing all the HTML tags is roughly like 51,000 tokens. And then if we convert that into Markdown, it takes about 69,000 tokens. But the raw HTML version will consume 183,000 tokens, roughly. So in this context, the Markdown version is far more economical in terms of AI consumption than HTML. So how can we fix this? Right now, there are a few solutions. The most popular solution is to generate Markdown files and then using LLMs to teach AIs to read them. So what is LLMs.txt, you may wonder. It's actually just a Markdown file at the root of your website, similar to robots.txt. And inside, you will list all the URLs you want with a short description of each. And the idea is that the agents will first fetch this file, read the content, and then understand, for example, it will see array.md and for fetching the array documentation, and then it will go straight to the Markdown version instead of the HTML version. And it's a very simple idea and actually rather easy to implement. And I actually started prototyping this like 2 months ago. Actually, right now it's 3 months. And it started with just like LLMs.txt support. And then I also tried to add a HTML and Markdown converter. It's a bit more work, but like it's still doable. But before I open the pull request, I actually tried to do some research to prove that that solution is actually needed. And my research showed that the industry is actually trying to solve the problem in the other direction. They try to give AI agents better tools, so they don't need to rely on websites supporting Markdown version. If we take Cloud Code as an example, if you ask it to read an HTML page, it will use a tool called WebFetch, which will already first convert HTML into Markdown. And if the documentation exceeds certain threshold, it will even use a cheaper model to summarize the Markdown version. And then the main agent will only consume that summarized version. And it's actually similar to whether it's actually a similar story if you look at other mainstream agents, whether it's Codex or OpenCode. The granularity will vary depending on the implementation, but it looks like this is the trend. So right now, do we need to build AI-specific documentation? Right now, the answer is actually no. And at the end of the day, there's actually nothing in documentation that's AI-specific, at least not now. And it's because AI shares the same content with us, and then it contributes to the same sources like us. And if we remove the token consumption side, it's basically the same documentation we all work on. And so the only way to make AI getting better at Ruby is to contribute to the documentation we already have. This includes the Ruby core documentation, the Gem documentation, and also your project's documentation. And as a RDoc maintainer, our job is to make sure RDoc makes the contribution experience easy and enjoyable. And that the documentation we see provides all the information that's valuable to us and is available to fetch. Okay, so that's all I have about Ruby's documentation today. Let me recap. First, what makes documentation useful for AI overlaps heavily with what makes it useful to developers. And second, RDoc 8.0 will ship the biggest improvement for Ruby documentation in years. It will provide a new parser, Markdown improvements, RBS type signatures, and then server mode. And third, there's still a lot of ahead, just not AI specific. We will have full Markdown migration, design annotations, and then I also want to do some Markdown parser refactor, so it's easier to fix bugs going ahead. And also better integration with other tools, such as RubySP or Rubyex. And there's plenty of work for us to do in the future to make RDoc better for everyone. And I want to thank Suto-san and Pen-san, both are Ruby committers, for reviewing my PRs in the last year and provided a lot of valuable feedback. And that's it. Thank you for listening. 有人有问题吗？
And I wanted to ask a question, and you actually mentioned in your last sentence it was the integration with Ruby LSP. Yep. You didn't speak about it. I see it's on the roadmap. As you know, you mentioned OpenCode, right? Yep. OpenCode actually has support for LSPs.
Cloud also does, and the default is RubySP already.
Okay, yeah, well, it's same with OpenCode. It's my favorite tool, so I know more about it. But you know, the agents can actually query in some limited fashion. They can query the LSP, and I was wondering how the work that you're doing, you imagine, could make the Ruby LSP, more useful to agents, stronger, providing type information also. Is anything that you could, reveal today?
So RubySP or like LSP support encoding agents in general, I think it's just a short-term solution from those agents teams to bridge the gap on existing tooling. And what I think will be more valuable is to directly provide NCP servers to those agents. So for example, I mentioned Rubyex, which has NCP server built in. And what it provides differently is that in RubySP, every request focus on one single target, right? But with NCP server, you can support multiple query targets at one time. And then you can support formats specific, optimized for AI consumption instead of optimized for VS Code or whatever the LSP standard specify. So first, I think we should not focus on integrating with Ruby LSP if the target is AI agents. We should focus on what we can integrate, what NCP server we can integrate with if our target is AI. So that's the first thing. And second is that, yes, I think there are deeper integration we can do. And as a matter of fact, right now the Rubyex project, going back to it, it already supports RBS parsing, and also it already contains all the Ruby core's RBS information, because we actually contribute to the RBS project and then build a ROS binding, and then so it can be used by Rubyex. So that's planned on the first day. What I think RDoc can contribute in this area is to provide its knowledge about documentation relationships. For example, if we ship annotations and then we make it a standard, then Rubyex can adopt that standard and then make the link inside the MCP response it returns. So as a tool, I think RDoc will not directly contribute to that part because it doesn't make sense for Rubyex to use RDoc. What RDoc can contribute is to set the standard and then specification on how we can advance Ruby's documentation, and then Rubyex and other tools can adopt that concept. And also, at the same time, we can improve Ruby's core documentation using that standard as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, actually, actually, I expected that kind of an answer because I think that, some form of, whether it's MCP or
Yeah. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, like I think this industry moves very fast. Like a year ago, I was prototyping a MCP server built directly into RubyXP, and then it didn't pan out. But right now, the direction has changed that you don't even need LSP server at all. You just have a indexer, like static analysis tool, and then you directly integrate that with AI. And I hope that doesn't change in the next 6 months, but like it will likely change again as well. Like,
what about maybe like shipping a pre-built skill, with RubyDocs that teaches?
Yeah, something like that.
Oh, 那我用中文问。
好，谢谢。
其实是跟这比较没关。其实好几年以前，我一直以为亚的会取代 RDoc， 所以我就完全就跳到亚那边了。那只是好奇说，你们在看今天的这个 slide 就觉得好像没机会了，看来 RDoc 还是会回来。但只是好奇说，你们会有讨论，做这些就是 improvement 的时候，我有讨论到 RDoc 亚的吗？
想一下，应该说过去应该是没有任何先例，就是比如说像 IRB 几年前，就是基本上就是被 Pry 取代，大家都会直接安装 Pry， 然后不用 IRB。然后也很多人说，为什么你不直接就是把 Pry 变成 default gen？ 那这其中我会说有2个主要原因，就是这件事情过去没有发生，以后也很难发生。第一个是以前没有先例，然后你在跟另外一个专案的 maintainer 沟通上的话，你要怎么样谈那个，就是这个 gem 现在是变成谁 maintain， 就是你要把它变成 Ruby committer， 还是你要让它变成这个 gem 的 maintainer， 然后变成 part of the Ruby team， 就是这个 governance 是还没有被解决，然后对。所以这是一个部分，然后还有第2个部分是比较技术上的。技术上的部分就是像 RDoc、IRB 这些 Ruby 的官方工具，它基本上必须要能够没有任何 dependency 的状况，直接跟 Ruby 本身 build。以 RDoc 来说好了，如果你今天在 Linux 上面，就是或是任何一个很小众 Ruby support 的 distribution 上面，你安装 Ruby，RDoc 必须要在那个地方可以 work， 所以所有的 RDoc 的 dependency 都要可以在那个平台上面 work， 而且它不能用任何 RubyJam， 因为 RubyJam 在 Ruby 安装之前就是还没有存在。那就代表说，你现在的专案，如果你已经用了任何不是 Ruby 官方的 dependency， 你要 merge 进来，你必须要把它 drop 掉。不然你没办法 merge 进来。那这又是另外一个，就是回到 governance， 就是我应该要去跟他说，你必须要 rewrite， 就是你某一个 big part of your project， 然后呢，你可以加入 RubyJam 嘛？那这个东西应该是谁开始提？所以最后我们目前倾向的方式就是，我们应该要让官方的工具变好，而不是就是每过几年，然后我们就去社群找更好的专案，然后进来取代。
Hello， 你好，就是我可以用中文吗？就是该怎么说？我不太确定会不会是我中间有些误解之类的。就是我在想说，有的时候我自己在看 RDoc， 然后有一些 gem 它的内容不是这么的详细，就它可能就是有很多很多的 method， 然后每一个就是会列说它的 input 是什么，然后 output 是什么，然后还有一行字，然后我就觉得说，就是不管该怎么说，就是叫 AI 看这个东西，真的会有帮助吗？就是如果比起说我直接 index 那一个 gem 的内容，然后就直接叫它去 search， 这两个东西比起来， 就我会有时候会想这件事情，这样子，对，就是我会想说，会把 RDoc 其实对人类来说还是比较友善，那 AI 是不是可以直接去查，就是 indexing 的东西就好，这样。
这件事情其实蛮有道理的，但在不同的情况下会有不同的限制。我们举例来说，如果你现在是你在 local 开发，然后你所有的 gem 安装在你的机器上面，那你今天要你的 AI agents 去读它们，这是完全没有问题的。那今天假设是，比如说是OpenAI 在训练新的 model，他们我不知道他们的方式如何，但他们可能就会从网络上找资料。那从网络上找资料的话，他们可能会去 index code， 或是他可以直接 index 处理好的文件。所以就是依据不同的使用情境，你还是会有的时候你不一定会有 source code， 或是 source code 它可能是在别的地方，没有那么好找。对。然后第二点是，既然在 local 状况下，你直接有 source code 就可以直接看到所有 documentation。对这个情况下，我觉得 RDoc 在这个情况下能够提供 AI 的帮助就不多了。那这也是为什么，好像在打广告，Rubyex 就是 Rubyex 它的 MCP server 里面，其中就是有的 request 就是你可以直接读，比如说我今天要看 user class， 你就可以去找 user 这个 declaration， 里面就会有包含它所有的文件 comments， 然后同时它还可以给你所有的 ancestors， 所有的 descendants。那在这个情况下，对你完全不需要 RDoc， 所以我觉得在 local 开发的话 ，RDoc 的空间会越来越小，就是它提供的帮助情况下，但对于一些，比如说他可能现在还没有用 AI 开发，他还是习惯自己去网络上看文件，这种状况，就是 RDoc 还是可以，就是还是必要的。也许可能5到10年之后，它就不需要存在了，也不一定。对。
对我补充一下，从 AI engineer 的角度补充这个问题。对，就我们刚刚在讨论说，就是我的 AI 可以直接去读 source code 这件事情。可是如果第一个就是如果你很常用 AI 去写这个东西，而且它是在 local 读得到你 source code 的时候，你会发现它会绕过很多 public method 去用 private method。所以 RDoc 的东西，或者说我们为什么要写一些 comment 在这些 public method 上，其实是去 describe 我的 intent， 我要去描述我的意图是什么。然后我希望的是 AI 在使用的时候正确的理解我设计这个东西的意图，而不是让它就是随意的去用任何 private method 或者是用任何 workaround 去绕过原本的设计意图这个东西。所以 RDoc 在这件事情上来说，我认为它还是有它的价值在，是描述开发者意图。而且未来我们让这些 AI 的 agent 去读这么多东西的时候，如果有一个很明确的 entry point， 就告诉他我的意图就是这样，我希望你这样使用的时候，它才可以更好的去使用这些 library。
这样它不就等于只是中间一个 filter 而已吗？就是一个 deterministic 的资讯 filter， 就是你只看到我要给你看到的。
对啊，但我直接去搜寻 source code 的时候，有很多其实是我不希望你去使用的东西。
可是，以后理论上 AI 不是应该要自己知道这件事情吗？
这个东西就
理
跟
想上啦，就是它应该自己可以判断，就像我们人类可以判断一样。
OK， 我觉得这东西就有点像是这些 LLM 的 model 的 training 的方式。它 training 的时候，它是在 predict 下一个 token 是什么。所以它其实不会直接理解到就是为什么这个 token 存在，它只是会认为说我现在有一段 code 在这里放进来之后，它是合理可以跑的东西。所以它不会知道我的意图是什么，所以我们在往上叠一层，就是所谓的像是 context engineer、prompt engineer 这种东西。那这个东西我就是去改变它在后续放 code 的时候，它为什么要放这个 code。所以这个时候我们就出现一个类似于就是一个 gap， 就是如果我 always 都让它直接去读 source code 的时候， 他其实不知道这个 source code 在这个 context 下是不是合理的，所以我透过 RDoc 我去写很少量的 comment， 其实就有点像是一个 guide， 就跟他讲说，你现在遇到这种情况的时候，我在这边我会希望你使用这个东西，而不是先去用另外一段东西。虽然它是等价的，但它可能是一个我已经 wrap 好的东西，所以在这种状况下，如果我没有足够的这种资讯在里面的时候 ，AI 写扣很可能就是我可能有一个 public 的 method， 然后这是一个 interface， 我就希望大家统一使用这个。可是我在 AI 写扣的时候，它就是随意的去扣下面的底层，然后自己去组成，所以我就有很多重复而且意图不明显或是混乱的东西混在里面。那如果我有一些文件类的东西，它去优先使用这个工具去搜寻、去确认的时候，它就会 follow 一个 best practice。所以这个东西你可以想象 agent skill 为什么会存在，就是告诉你我有一个 best practice 在这，你应该优先使用我的 best practice。
那你觉得现在 RDoc 有真的有帮助到这件事情吗？
至少我去年应该是去年吧，去年的那个 talk 就是我用 RDoc 去告诉他我所有 DSL 的结构，然后他优先看 RDoc， 然后往下做的时候，他就会比较就是提高很多准确的去使用 DSL， 而不会很随意的去直接捞我的 source code 去猜说为什么他这边可以放。
那这样子听起来，在之后我们在开发 Rubyex 的时候，在回传的那个 declaration 的 documentation 的时候，我也可以设定说，我只回传 visibility public 之类，有类似这种 filter 的方式。
对，我觉得这个就会比较有帮助，因为像我在用一些 TypeScript 的 library 的时候，我希望他帮我写一个测试，然后他为了 pass 这个测试，因为 AI 的 training 就是这样，就是追求成果的成功，然后为了 pass 这个测试呢，他会去找到这个 TypeScript library 里面很大量的 private method， 然后全部 mark 掉这些 private method， 然后我测试是过的，但我程式不是正常运作的。这就从 AI engineer 的角度补充啊，就是
感谢分享。
想问的吗？好吧，那没有的话，我们就谢谢江浙 Stan， 然后对。